Coming up on Arirang News, South Korean President Moon Jae-in holds a meeting of the Emergency Economic Council in which he pledges the government's full fiscal capacity to overcoming the economic crisis. That'll include support for what's being called a Korean New Deal. The government and the ruling Democratic Party agree on a third extra budget of a record size to fund those efforts. Expected to be worth some $24 billion, the party wants it passed by the end of this month. And South Korea's exports were down sharply again in May as the pandemic saps demand. But with imports down as well, the country was able to post a trade surplus. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. Some daycare centers in South Korea have reopened 3 months after they were closed due to the outbreak. But those in Seoul, Incheon, and Gyeonggi-do province will remain shut until the number of new infections comes down. Those that have reopened have to follow guidelines like staff wearing face masks and checking everyone's temperature. The government decided to reopen daycares because of the strain their closure was putting on their emergency childcare services for parents who need to work. Meanwhile, the country reported 35 new cases of COVID-19 on Monday, concentrated in the region near Seoul. There was an additional death as well, bringing the death toll to 271. Now, the biggest and best-known beach in Korea, Haeundae, in the city of Busan, opens to the public today. City officials are taking extra precautions, though, for COVID-19. Jang Tae-hyun tells us more.
Starting with the popular Haeundae Beach, 267 beaches nationwide are to open by the end of July. To prevent the spread of the virus, the government has advised people to avoid visiting large crowded beaches and to avoid large groups.
It was so frustrating to stay home, so it feels great to be at the beach. My child loves it as well.
The Busan Metropolitan City government has decided to open Haeundae and Songjeong Beach in June, but it's calling it a safe opening to emphasize that extra precautions will be taken. The major difference is that there will be no landing of parasols or inflatable tubes. Also, COVID-19 prevention guidelines have been posted to remind people to keep a safe distance from others and to wear face masks whenever they're not in the water. The Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries is also advising visitors to refrain from spitting, blowing their nose, or using the public shower facilities.
We're going to check if the provisions are followed well this month and prepare for the full opening of beaches in July.
In Haeundae, 55 staff from the Fire Department, Maritime Police, and Haeundae Police Station will man a watchtower to ensure visitors' safety and maintain public order. There will also be a box where people can drop their name cards. This means the authorities can more easily trace them if someone on the beach is found to have COVID-19. Jang Tae-hyun, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in said today that the so-called Korean New Deal is a national development strategy aimed at building a country that's a leader, not a follower. He was chairing a session of the Emergency Economic Council to discuss the country's economic policy direction for the second half of the year. Here's the president.
디지털 뉴딜과 그린 뉴딜을 두 축으로 나란히 세운 한국판 뉴딜을 국가의 미래를 걸고 강력히 추진해 나갈 것입니다. 우리 경제를 추격형 경제에서 선도형 경제로 전환해 나가면서 대규모 일자리 창출로 새로운 기회를 열어 나가겠습니다.
Moon said that the Korean New Deal will be funded in part by the government's proposed third extra budget, but he stressed that's just the beginning. He said the government will seek out new projects and expand the size of its investment, with a comprehensive plan to come in July. Moon also said that the government will turn the country's quarantine industry into a new engine for exports, and it'll foster new industries such as bio and future cars to prepare for a post-coronavirus era. And the third extra budget President Moon mentioned will be the biggest supplementary budget to date. The ruling party and the government have agreed on a proposal which they want to pass by the end of the month. Kim Mo-gan reports.
To help the country overcome COVID-19, the government and the ruling Democratic Party have agreed a third supplementary budget proposal, the largest such budget ever. In a meeting held at the National Assembly on Monday, the two sides vowed to pass the third extra budget by as early as June.
The government stressed the necessity of the budget and called for the parliament's support in getting it passed swiftly.
We will work to pass the third budget within the June extraordinary session as soon as we finish finalizing the structure of the 21st National Assembly.
Though the exact size of the budget is yet to be announced, it's widely expected to surpass $24 billion. Much of the third extra budget will be used to cope with the economic fallout from the pandemic, especially in supporting the nation's businesses. The two sides plan to inject up to $8.1 billion for emergency funding of small enterprises and establish funds worth $25 billion to stabilize the bond and stock markets. The ruling party will also use the budget to pursue its #1 campaign pledge, which is to expand public Wi-Fi to lessen telecommunications costs for the general public. The party seeks to install 41,000 public Wi-Fi points by 2022. Parts of the budget will also be used to create around 550,000 emergency jobs in the digital sector and to expand support for unstable jobs and the social safety net. The budget will also raise the age for free flu shots so that an extra 2.4 million teenagers aged 18 and below will be able to receive the vaccines. The two sides plan to finance the massive budget by restructuring how the country spends its tax revenue and will make up the rest of it through national debt. Once the budget gets passed, the ruling party and the government hope to implement 75% of the budget within 3 months. The opposition also agreed on the need for a large-scale budget and claimed that they will cooperate if the proposal is deemed reasonable. Kim Mo-gyan, Arirang News.
South Korea's exports were down in May by about 24% from a year earlier to about $35 billion. According to the Trade Ministry, exports of automobiles declined 54% and petroleum products nearly 70% on year. The trade balance in May, however, was back in the black with a surplus of about $440 million. That's despite there being 1.5 fewer business days. Exports of biohealth products, which include COVID-19 test kits, soared by around 59%, and computer exports jumped roughly 83% due to the increased demand for non-contact services. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, thank you for making time today.
Happy to be here.
Well, U.S. stocks ended Friday mixed but mostly higher. Korean shares strongly higher today as well, despite the rising tensions between Washington and Beijing. Tell us about the global markets and the Korean financial markets in particular.
Okay, well, the real economy seems to be undergoing a pretty much dark stage right now, not only because of the coronavirus, but because of the riots that are going on in the United States. But the stock markets, for the most part, doesn't seem to reflect that. U.S. had a very good last week. The Dow went down a little bit at Friday. Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ rose for most of the last week. And again, it does not seem to have been affected by the escalation of U.S.-China trade war or the news that the recovery from coronavirus is likely to last until 2021. It's probably due to optimism over the economy opening up, getting out of the shutdown. But still, we'll have to see this week whether the riots that are happening in the United States will affect the U.S. stock markets. Asian markets, again, were mostly good today, except possibly Hong Kong. Nikkei went up most of last week, except Friday when it went down a little bit, but it went back up today. China was up most of last week and today. And as I said, Hong Kong it was down most of the last week, but it actually went up a little bit today. So Asian markets had a fairly good day today. And as you mentioned, Korea Kospi, after leveling off for most of late last week, it rose today by 1.75%. Kosdaq also continued the rising trend that it began on Thursday, and it went up today by 3.09%. So even though the news in the real economy hasn't been really that good, stock market seems to be having a positive momentum of its own.
Well, now we saw Korea's exports way down for a third month in a row. Imports down also, though, in part because of the plunge in oil prices. So we are back in a surplus. The trade minister today said he sees a recovery down the road. Tell us about that.
Okay, well, in a sense, Korean trade in May did stage a mini comeback. If you look at just the 10 days, May 1st to May 10th, exports had fallen by 46.3%, but if you look at the figures for the entire May today, it fell by 23.7%. Now, falling by 23.7% obviously is not a good number, but still, compared to the 46.3% fall that we had for the first 10 days, it seems like it did recover toward the latter part of May, and similar story can be told on imports. Now, the reason that we had a very sudden drop of 24.6% in April and the 23.7% in May is probably due because, well, the Western economy, the U.S., EU, and Japan, they all had a shutdown and lockdown starting in April, and that came very suddenly, so Korean trade fell very suddenly as well. But China, from May, is returning more or less to normality. So if you look at trade to China, it's only 2.8% down from last May. All the other regions, the U.S., it's down 29.3%, EU down 25%, and ASEAN is down 30%. So one of the reasons why Korean exports did seem to recover toward the end of the month was that China was returning to normality. Most of the export items are firmly in the negative. Automobiles down 54%, automobile down 66%, petrochemicals down 69%. That's partially because the price of oil has fallen so much, but also because the volume of exports has fallen as well. But there's slight good news. Semiconductor exports rose by 7%, computers by 83%, and biohealth items went up by 59%. And also another point is that even though it's a bit of a recessionary surplus, the Korean trade account returned to a surplus. And that's important at this point because the global financial markets are very nervous. Korea is increasing its government deficit and debt because we increased spending, tried to get out of the coronavirus recession. And there's a lot of countries which are in danger of going into a currency crisis. So if Korea had continued getting a trade deficit, that might have given some nervous signals to international investors. But even though it's a recessionary surplus due to falling exports, but even greater falling imports, still having a surplus is a slight bit of a good news.
Well, Professor, we're almost out of time, but real quick, what's coming up this week? We have President Moon talking about the Korean New Deal, also data coming up on consumer prices.
Okay, well, big news there is that government GDP growth forecast is positive 0.1%. That's slightly less than KDI's estimate of 0.02% positive, and a lot more than the Bank of Korea estimate of minus 0.2% growth. And we will have the European Central Bank monetary policy speech coming up and the latest U.S. unemployment rate and wage data coming up this week. So those will show us roughly how the global economy is doing.
All right, Professor Yang, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks so much for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
After cutting flights by almost 90% because of the pandemic, South Korea's airlines are gradually restarting their international flights. Some are also using their passenger planes for cargo. Kim Dami has this report.
The Korean aviation industry is spreading its wings again. The country's national flag carrier Korean Air will reopen 13 international routes starting Monday. The routes include Washington, D.C., Seattle, Chicago, Kuala Lumpur, and Amsterdam. For the passengers' return to the skies during a global pandemic, local airlines are more geared up than ever.
From May 18, all domestic passengers are required to wear face masks, and passengers can now scan their own boarding pass before getting on the plane.
Local low-cost carriers have also hopped on the move by gradually expanding overseas routes. However, flights to China remain idle because the Chinese aviation authorities have not lifted the so-called one airline, one route restriction. The sky route's resumption also comes following a high cargo demand.
With the high cargo demand, we're temporarily expanding the number of passenger planes for carrying cargoes and the number of main routes for those planes.
In fact, by refitting some of their passenger planes to carry cargo, Asian Airlines sales of cargo outperformed sales from their passengers for the first time in March. But a revitalization of the aviation industry still heavily relies on passengers traveling. While some European countries are welcoming back foreign visitors, South Korea has extended its special travel advisory to June 19. The road back to recovering passenger demand during this pandemic may be turbulent, but local international flights are once again taking off for their passengers while satisfying new purposes and needs. 김다미, 아리랑 뉴스.
Samsung Electronics has announced that it's going to invest around $6.5 billion to set up a new production line for NAND flash memory at its chip campus at Pyeongtaek, just south of Seoul. The tech giant's latest plan comes just 10 days after it said it'll build a new $8 billion line also at Pyeongtaek for chips on the 5-nanometer scale for AI and 5G. Samsung's recently seen high demand for its chips, one of the few bright spots in South Korea's exports. The city of Seoul is going to help some 2,500 low-income households and another 300 newlywed couples get homes to live in under long-term leases. In Korea, such leases require big lump sum deposits, which can be many times an individual's salary, so the city is going to provide up to 95% of them. For low-income households, the limit for the total deposit will be about $180,000. For newlyweds, it has to be under about $490,000. The actual owner of the home will sign the lease with the city, which then sublets the home to the tenant. The lease is for 2 years and can be renewed up to 9 times if the tenant remains eligible. Applications will be accepted starting next Wednesday at local community centers. And that does it for this newscast. Thank you for watching.